Some wounds never heal, they just learn to ache in silence. The hardest thing about loving someone isn't losing them. It's seeing them again and remembering why you fell so hard in the first place. Christmas Eve, 1887, brought more than snow to Elk Hollow, Wyoming. Jedediah Boone rode into town for supplies, his dog Bear at his side. He never expected to see Clara behind the counter of the general store. His ex-wife looked as beautiful as the day she left him 5 years ago. Their words were cold and bitter. Years of hurt stood between them like a wall. But Bear had other ideas. The old dog recognized Clara right away and led her to something that changed everything, a place where their names were still carved in an old birch tree. What happened next would prove that sometimes love gets a second chance when you least expect it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountains had been Jedediah Boone's home for the better part of 5 years now, ever since Clara walked out of his life and took the warmth with her. His cabin sat perched on a ridge overlooking the Elk River Valley, a simple structure of hewn logs and chinked mud that kept the wind out and his thoughts in. It wasn't much to look at, a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a bed that felt too big for one man, but it suited him well enough. Bear, his faithful companion, was the only living thing that shared his solitude. The dog was getting on in years, his muzzle now more grey than brown, but his loyalty remained as steadfast as the mountains themselves. Bear had been a wedding gift from Clara's father, back when there was still hope that Jed might make something of himself beyond trapping and trading. The old rancher had said every man needed a good dog, especially one trying to build a life with his daughter. That was before everything went to pieces, before the harsh winters and failed crops, before the arguments that grew louder and the silences that grew longer. Jed kept Clara's memory locked away in a small wooden box beneath his bed, alongside the worn gold band he'd removed from his finger the day she left. Sometimes, when the whiskey made him brave or foolish, he'd take out the ring and turn it over in his weathered hands, remembering how it felt when she first slipped it on. The metal had grown thin from years of wear, and he could still make out the inscription they'd had etched inside, forever and always. C&J. Those words felt like a cruel joke now. But he couldn't bring himself to throw the ring away any more than he could forget the woman who'd given it meaning. The life of a mountain trapper was hard and lonely, but it had its rhythms. Jed would rise before dawn, check his snares and traps, then spend the day working the trap lines that stretched across 15 miles of wilderness. Beaver pelts were his bread and butter, though he'd take marten, fox, or anything else the mountains offered. The work was brutal in winter, trudging through snow that sometimes reached his waist, hands so cold they'd crack and bleed, the constant threat of getting lost in a blizzard. But it was honest work, and it kept his mind occupied during the daylight hours. Evenings were the hardest. That's when the silence pressed in around him like a living thing, and the cabin felt more like a tomb than a home. He'd cook whatever game he'd caught, usually rabbit stew or venison, and share it with Bear by the fire. The dog was a good listener, never judging when Jed talked aloud about his day or his regrets. Sometimes he'd read from one of the 3 books he owned, the Bible his mother had given him, a collection of Shakespeare that Clara had left behind, and a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe that seemed fitting for a man marooned in the wilderness of his own making. The worst nights were when the wind howled through the peaks and reminded him of Clara's laughter, or when the moonlight on fresh snow looked like the white dress she'd worn on their wedding day. Those were the nights he'd drink too much of the whiskey he traded for in town, trying to drown out the voice in his head that whispered he'd thrown away the best thing that ever happened to him. Clara McBride, she'd taken back her maiden name after the divorce, had built herself a new life in Elk Hollow. She worked at her sister Margaret's general store, helping with the books and serving customers with a grace that made even the roughest cowboys tip their hats and mind their language. Margaret had married well to a man named Thomas Miller, who owned not just the store but a good chunk of land outside town. They'd welcomed Clara with open arms when she showed up 5 years ago, heartbroken and carrying nothing but a carpet bag and her pride. The people of Elk Hollow had grown fond of Clara over the years. She had a way about her, gentle but strong, the kind of woman who could calm a crying child or talk sense into a drunk cowboy with equal skill. She taught Sunday school at the Little White Church, organized charity drives for struggling families, and had turned Margaret's store into something of a social hub where the town's women would gather to share news and gossip over bolts of fabric and jars of preserves. But for all her good works and social graces, those who knew Clara well could see the sadness she carried. It lived in the way her smile never quite reached her eyes, in how she'd grow quiet when couples walked by hand in hand, in the careful way she avoided any conversation that might drift toward talk of her former husband. Margaret worried about her sister, encouraged her to consider the advances of several eligible bachelors in town, but Clara always found polite ways to decline. She'd made her peace with solitude, or so she told herself. The truth was more complicated. Clara had loved Jedediah Boone with a fierce devotion that frightened her sometimes. When they'd married, she'd believed they could build something beautiful together, a ranch, a family, a life filled with purpose and joy. But Jed had always been a man more comfortable in the wilderness than in civilization, and their small homestead had never been enough to hold his restless spirit. The failed crops, the harsh winters, the isolation, all of it had slowly worn away at their marriage like water-carving stone. The final straw had come during their third winter together. Jed had been gone for 2 weeks on a hunting trip, leaving Clara alone in their cabin with nothing but beans and salt pork to eat, and only the howling wind for company. When he'd returned with a deer and a grin, expecting gratitude, she'd unleashed 5 years of frustration and loneliness. The fight that followed had been their worst yet, full of accusations and home truths that cut deep. Jed had stormed out that night and hadn't returned for 3 days. When he finally came back, Clara was packing her bags. "I can't do this anymore, Jed," she'd said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I love you, but I can't live like this." "I won't." He'd stood in the doorway watching her fold her dresses into the carpet bag, his face a mask of stubborn pride. "Where will you go?" "Margaret's invited me to stay with her and Thomas. I can help with the store, make myself useful. And us?" The question had come out rougher than he'd intended, like gravel under a wagon wheel. Clara had paused in her packing, her hands trembling as she held one of his shirts. For a moment, he thought she might change her mind, might give them one more chance. Instead, she'd set the shirt aside and looked at him with eyes full of sorrow. "There is no us anymore. Jed, we're just 2 people hurting each other because we don't know how to love properly." She'd left the next morning, riding away in Thomas Miller's wagon without looking back. Jed had watched from the cabin door until the wagon disappeared around the bend, then gone inside and drunk himself senseless. When he'd sobered up 3 days later, he'd found Bear sitting by Clara's empty chair, whimpering softly. The dog had looked at him with such accusation in his brown eyes that Jed had felt ashamed of himself for the first time in years. Now, 5 years later, both Jed and Clara had settled into their separate routines, like 2 rivers that had once flowed together, but now followed different paths to the sea. Jed told himself he was content with his solitary life in the mountains, while Clara convinced herself that her work in town was fulfilling enough. Neither was entirely honest with themselves, but lies we tell ourselves can sometimes be the kindest mercy we know. The morning of Christmas Eve dawned clear and bitter cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made every breath feel like swallowing ice. Jed had been planning to spend the holiday alone, as he had for the past 4 years, but his supplies were running dangerously low. Coffee, flour, sugar, and salt, all the staples that kept a man alive through the mountain winter. He'd put off the trip to town as long as possible, but necessity finally overcame his reluctance to venture into the world of other people. Bear seemed to sense something different about this trip. The old dog's tail wagged with an enthusiasm Jed hadn't seen in months as he watched his master saddle up the mare. Perhaps it was the prospect of seeing other people, Or maybe dogs had a way of knowing when important things were about to happen. Either way, Bear trotted alongside the horse with an energy that made him seem years younger as they descended from the high country toward Elk Hollow. The town looked like something from a Christmas card when they arrived, snow covering the rooftops and hanging from the eaves in perfect white curtains. Warm yellow light spilled from the windows of houses and businesses, and the smell of wood smoke and cooking food filled the air. Children's laughter echoed from the town square, where someone had built a snowman, and the church bells were practicing Christmas carols with varying degrees of success. Jed felt like an intruder in this scene of domestic happiness, a wild thing that had wandered in from the cold. He dismounted in front of Miller's General Store, the only place in town sure to be open on Christmas Eve, and tied his horse to the hitching post. Bear sat beside him, ears perked forward, as if sensing something important was about to happen. Neither man nor dog was prepared for what waited inside that warm, lamp-lit store. Neither expected that this Christmas Eve would be anything more than a necessary chore before returning to their mountain solitude. But sometimes the most ordinary moments become the hinges on which our whole lives turn. And sometimes the simplest encounters can change everything we thought we knew about love, loss, and the possibility of second chances. The brass bell above the door chimed as Jed stepped into Miller's General Store, bringing with him a swirl of cold air and snowflakes that melted instantly in the warmth. The familiar sense of the place hit him immediately. Coffee beans, leather goods, soap, and that particular mixture of wool and wood oil that seemed to permeate every general store he'd ever been in. But there was something else, something that made him stop short just inside the doorway. Lavender. The faint scent of lavender soap, delicate and haunting. He knew that scent, had dreamed about it more nights than he cared to admit. His eyes adjusted to the lamplight, taking in the familiar shelves stocked with dry goods, tools and sundries. Thomas Miller stood behind the counter as usual, but today he wasn't alone. A woman in a sapphire blue dress was organizing bolts of fabric on a side table, her back turned to the door. Dark hair swept up in an elegant knot, a slender waist, the graceful way she moved her hands. Clara. Time seemed to freeze like water in a mountain stream. 5 years collapsed into nothing, and suddenly Jed was 25 again, watching his new bride arrange their meager belongings in their first cabin. The floor beneath his feet might as well have been quicksand, because he couldn't seem to move forward or back. Bear, sensing his master's distress, pressed close against his leg with a soft whine. At the sound, Clara turned. Their eyes met across the store, and Jed felt like he'd been kicked by a mule. She was even more beautiful than his memories had painted her, if such a thing were possible. The years had added a maturity to her face that only made her more striking, and the sapphire dress brought out the deep blue of her eyes. But those eyes that had once looked at him with such love, now held nothing but cool politeness and old pain. "Jedediah," she said, her voice steady as mountain stone. "Thomas, you have a customer." Thomas Miller looked up from his ledger, his round face creasing into a nervous smile. Everyone in Elk Hollow knew the story of Jed and Clara Boone, though most were polite enough not to gossip about it openly. "Afternoon, Jed. Come in for supplies, I expect." Jed managed to nod, though his mouth felt full of cotton. "Coffee, flour, the usual." Of course. "Clara, would you mind getting Mr. Boone's order together? I need to finish these accounts before Mrs. Henderson comes by." Clara's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she moved toward the shelves with practiced efficiency. "Certainly. How much coffee do you need, Jedediah?" The formal use of his full name stung worse than the Wyoming wind. She'd always called him Jed, except when she was angry with him. Hearing his given name from her lips now felt like a door, slamming shut. 2 pounds should do, he managed, watching as she reached for a burlap sack on the high shelf. She'd always been tall for a woman, but the shelf was just beyond her reach. In the old days, he would have stepped forward to help, might have used the excuse to brush against her, to catch another hint of that lavender scent. Now he stood frozen, unsure if his help would be welcome. Clara stretched higher, her fingertips just touching the sack. Bear, who had been sitting quietly beside Jed, suddenly trotted forward and placed his front paws on a wooden crate, as if trying to help her reach the shelf. "Bear, no," Jed called sharply. But the damage was done. Clara looked down at the dog, and something shifted in her expression. The careful mask of indifference slipped, revealing a flicker of warmth that made Jed's heart stutter. "Bear," she whispered, kneeling down to the dog's level. "Oh my goodness, is it really you?" The old dog's tail began wagging so hard his entire body shook. He pressed against Clara's outstretched hands, whining softly as she scratched behind his ears in the exact spot he'd always loved. For a moment, Clara's composure cracked completely, and Jed could see the woman he'd married, the one who used to sneak Bear scraps from the dinner table and let him sleep by the fire on cold nights. "He remembers you," Jed said quietly. Surprised by the roughness in his own voice, Clara's hands stilled on Bear's fur, and she looked up at Jed with something that might have been accusation. "You kept him. He was yours as much as mine. More, maybe. He moped for months after you left." "Don't." The word came out sharper than she'd intended. Clara stood up quickly, smoothing her skirts and rebuilding the wall between them. "Don't make this about that. I wasn't trying to. Here's your coffee." She placed the sack on the counter with more force than necessary. "What else do you need?" The conversation continued in clipped, formal tones. Flour, sugar, salt, a bottle of lamp oil. Each transaction was conducted with the efficiency of strangers, though Thomas Miller watched them both with growing discomfort. The tension in the small store was thick enough to cut with a knife. It was Bear who broke the stalemate. While Jed counted out coins for his purchases, the dog had wandered toward the back of the store, where a small window looked out onto the alley. He began pawing at the door that led to the rear exit, whining and looking back at Clara with expectant brown eyes. "What's gotten into him?" Thomas muttered, but Clara had gone very still. "He wants to go outside," she said softly. "To the back," Jed frowned. "Bear, come here." But the dog ignored him, continuing to paw at the door and whine. Finally, Clara moved toward him, her face pale. "I think I know what he wants to show us," she said, so quietly that only Jed could hear. "Clara, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do." She looked at him then, really looked at him. And he saw the same mixture of pain and longing in her eyes that he felt in his own chest. "Thomas, I'm going to step outside for a moment. Will you finish with Mr. Boone's order?" Thomas nodded, though he looked puzzled by the sudden change in atmosphere. Clara moved to the back door, and Bear practically danced with excitement as she opened it. The dog bounded outside into the snow, then turned back to make sure they were following. Jed hesitated. Every instinct told him to pay for his supplies and leave, to ride back up into the mountains, where it was safe and solitary, and his heart couldn't be broken all over again. But Clara was already stepping outside, and Bear was looking at him with such expectation that he felt compelled to follow. The alley behind the store was narrow and shadowed, filled with stacked crates and barrels. But Bear led them past all of that, toward the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open space. There, standing like a sentinel against the white landscape, was an old birch tree that Jed remembered all too well. Clara stopped walking when she saw it, her breath coming out in small puffs of vapor in the cold air. "It's still there." "Yeah," Jed said, moving up beside her. "Still there." The tree was larger now, its white bark marked with the scars and growth of 5 years. But there, about chest-high on the trunk, were the letters they had carved during their courtship. C+J forever. The words were weathered but still clearly visible, a testament to young love and foolish promises. Bear sat down in the snow beneath the tree, looking back at them both with what could only be described as satisfaction. The old dog had remembered, and he had brought them back to this place where their story had begun. Now he seemed to be waiting to see if they were brave enough to write a new ending, standing there in the falling snow, with their past carved into the bark before them and 5 years of hurt and loneliness between them. Clara and Jed faced the question that had haunted them both. Was love strong enough to survive the worst we could do to it? And if it was, did they have the courage to try again? The silence stretched between them like a frozen river, beautiful but treacherous. Clara reached out tentatively and traced the carved letters with her gloved fingertip. Her touch so light it barely disturbed the thin layer of snow that had settled in the grooves. "I remember when you carved this," she said softly. "You borrowed Thomas Miller's knife and spent an hour making sure the letters were perfect." "You said it was foolish," Jed replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Said trees grew and the letters would get distorted. They have grown." Clara's finger followed the stretched curves where the bark had expanded. "But they're still readable." Bear had settled himself in the snow at the base of the tree, watching them both with the patient wisdom that only old dogs possess. His tail thumped occasionally against the ground, as if he approved of what was happening but didn't want to interrupt. Jed shifted his weight from one foot to the other, suddenly aware of how close Clara was standing, close enough that he could smell that lavender scent again, could see the individual snowflakes catching on her dark eyelashes. She looked different somehow, not just older but more self-possessed. The frightened young woman who had left him 5 years ago had been replaced by someone who knew her own worth. "You look well," he said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "Town life agrees with you." Clara's laugh held no humor. "Do I? Because I feel like I've been holding my breath for 5 years, waiting for something I couldn't name." She turned to face him fully. "And now here you are, and I still can't breathe properly." The honesty in her voice nearly undid him. Jed had prepared himself for anger, for coldness, for the polite indifference she'd shown him in the store. But this raw vulnerability was something else entirely, something that made his chest ache with longing and regret. "Clara, I don't." She held up a hand to stop him. "Don't apologize. Don't make excuses. I'm not ready for that yet." They stood in awkward silence for another moment before Clara spoke again, her voice stronger now. "Tell me about your life, Jed. The mountains. Are you happy?" The question caught him off guard. Was he happy? He'd convinced himself that contentment was enough, that a man couldn't ask for more than shelter, food, and the satisfaction of honest work. But standing here with Clara, surrounded by the evidence of what they'd once been to each other, happiness seemed like a foreign concept. "I'm alive," he said finally. "I have good trap lines, a decent cabin. Bear keeps me company. That's not what I asked." He met her eyes, those deep blue eyes that had always seen too much. "No, I'm not happy. Haven't been since the day you left." The admission hung between them like smoke from a campfire. Clara's expression softened, but she didn't move closer. "I tried to be," she said quietly. "Margaret and Thomas have been wonderful to me. The work at the store keeps me busy, and I've made friends in town. I teach Sunday school, help with church socials. On paper, it's a good life, but I go to bed every night in that little room above the store, and I wonder what would have happened if I'd been stronger, if I'd tried harder to make our marriage work instead of running away when things got difficult." Jed felt something shift inside his chest, like ice beginning to crack in spring. "You didn't run away. You saved yourself from a man who didn't know how to love you properly. Maybe, or maybe I was just too scared to fight for what we had." A gust of wind sent snow swirling around them, and Clara shivered. Without thinking, Jed stepped closer and began to shrug out of his heavy coat. "No," Clara said quickly. "I'm fine. You're cold. I'm always cold in winter. I learned to live with it." The words hit him like a physical blow. She'd always run cold, had always sought out his warmth on winter nights. He'd loved how she'd curl against him under their quilts, her feet like ice blocks against his legs, until his body heat warmed her through. The idea that she'd spent 5 years being cold, with no one to warm her, made something fierce and protective rise up in his chest. "This was a mistake," Clara said suddenly, wrapping her arms around herself. "I shouldn't have come out here with you." "Why did you?" "Because Bear asked me to." She looked down at the dog, who'd been watching their conversation with interest. "And because I needed to see if it still hurt as much as I remembered." "Does it?" "More." The word came out as barely a whisper. "It hurts more." Before Jed could respond, voices carried from the front of the store. Thomas Miller was calling Clara's name, and there was worry in his tone. "I have to go," Clara said, but she didn't move immediately. Instead, she looked once more at the carved tree, then at Bear, then finally at Jed. "This can't happen again. I won't put myself through this." "Clara, wait." But she was already walking back toward the store, her sapphire skirt swishing through the snow. Bear whined and started to follow her, then looked back at Jed with what could only be described as disappointment. "I know, old boy," Jed murmured, kneeling down to scratch the dog's ears. "I know." By the time they made it back to the store, Clara had composed herself completely. She stood behind the counter with Thomas, her face a mask of professional courtesy as she wrapped Jed's purchases in brown paper. "That'll be $4.30, she said, without looking at him. Jed counted out the money, his fingers lingering on hers for just a moment as he placed the coins in her palm. She pulled her hand back as if burned. "Thank you for your business," she said formally. "Have a blessed Christmas." The dismissal was clear, but Jed found himself reluctant to leave. There was so much left unsaid, so many questions hanging in the air between them. But Thomas Miller was watching with obvious discomfort, and Clara had made her wishes clear. "You too," Jed said finally. He gathered his supplies and headed for the door, Bear trailing behind him with obvious reluctance. As they stepped out into the snowy street, Jed turned back for one last look through the store window. Clara was standing exactly where he'd left her, but her carefully controlled expression had cracked. Even through the glass, he could see the tears she was trying not to shed. The sight nearly brought him to his knees. Every instinct screamed at him to go back, to take her in his arms and promise that things would be different this time. But 5 years of separation had taught him something about humility. Some things couldn't be fixed with good intentions and desperate words. Some things required time, patience, and proof that people could change. He mounted his horse and rode slowly out of town, Bear trotting alongside with his head hung low. Neither of them looked back, but both carried the weight of that encounter like stones in their hearts. Christmas Eve was supposed to be a time of joy and celebration, but for Jed and Clara, it had become something else entirely. A reckoning with the past, and a glimpse of possibilities that might forever remain out of reach. The ride back to the cabin felt longer than usual, though whether that was due to the deepening snow or the weight of his thoughts, Jed couldn't say. Bear kept pace beside the horse, but the dog's usual enthusiasm for the journey home was notably absent. Every few minutes he would stop and look back toward town, as if hoping Clara might somehow appear on the trail behind them. "She's not coming." "Old boy," Jed said softly, and Bear's ears drooped further. The cabin, when they finally reached it, felt smaller and more isolated than ever before. Jed went through the motions of caring for his horse, bringing in firewood and preparing a simple meal, but his mind remained fixed on those moments behind the general store. The way Clara had traced their carved initials with such tenderness, the raw honesty in her voice when she'd admitted to holding her breath for 5 years, the tears in her eyes as he'd walked away. He'd spent half a decade convincing himself that their marriage had been doomed from the start, that they'd been too young and too different to make it work. But seeing her again had shattered those careful rationalizations. The truth was simpler and more painful. He'd been a fool who'd let pride and stubbornness destroy the best thing in his life. That night, for the first time in years, Jed retrieved the wooden box from beneath his bed. Inside, along with his wedding ring, were the few mementos he'd kept from their marriage. A pressed flower from Clara's wedding bouquet, brittle now and brown with age. A letter she'd written him during their brief courtship, full of hope and dreams for their future. A photograph taken on their wedding day by the traveling photographer who'd passed through Elk Hollow that spring. Jed studied the photograph by lamplight, tracing Clara's young face with his finger. She'd been radiant that day, her smile bright enough to outshine the sun. He looked impossibly young himself, his face smooth and optimistic in a way that seemed foreign now. They'd believed they could conquer anything together, that love was enough to overcome any obstacle. Perhaps it could have been, if he'd been wiser, if he'd listened more and talked less. If he'd understood that Clara needed partnership, not protection from the world. Bear curled up beside the fire, but even the dog seemed restless. shifting position frequently and occasionally lifting his head to stare at the door as if expecting someone to arrive. The cabin that had been their sanctuary felt charged with possibility and regret. Meanwhile, in town, Clara was having her own sleepless night. The small room above Miller's general store had been her home for 5 years, but tonight it felt like a prison. She tried to lose herself in mending, then in reading her Bible, but her mind kept drifting back to those carved letters and the raw pain in Jed's voice when he'd said he hadn't been happy. Since she left, Margaret had noticed her distraction at dinner and pressed gently for details about the encounter with Jed. Clara had shared only the barest facts, that he'd come in for supplies, that they'd exchanged polite words, that it had been awkward but civil. She couldn't bring herself to mention the tree or Bear's recognition, or the way her heart had hammered against her ribs the entire time. "You still love him," Margaret had said quietly over their evening tea. "Love him?" Clara had laughed, but it sounded brittle even to her own ears. "Margaret, that man broke my heart so thoroughly I wasn't sure I had one left. That's not what I asked." Clara had retreated to her room after that, unwilling to continue a conversation that cut too close to truths she wasn't ready to face. But alone in the darkness, with only the sound of wind rattling the windows for company, those truths pressed in around her like wolves. She did still love him, had never stopped loving him, despite all her efforts to convince herself otherwise. The 5 years of separation had been an attempt to heal, to build a life that didn't revolve around the hollow ache of his absence. But seeing him today had proven how futile that effort had been. One look into those familiar grey eyes, and she was 22 again, desperately in love with a man who seemed determined to break both their hearts. The worst part was that she could see the changes in him. The boy who'd married her had been eager and impulsive, quick to anger but quick to forgive. The man who'd stood beneath that birch tree today carried himself differently, more carefully, as if he'd learned that words and actions had lasting consequences. There was a gravity to him now that spoke of hard-won wisdom and genuine regret. But wisdom and regret weren't enough to rebuild a marriage, were they? They'd tried so hard the first time, and it had ended in such spectacular failure that Clara had spent years picking up the pieces of herself. Did she have the courage to risk that kind of devastation again? The questions circled in her mind like buzzards, offering no easy answers. She found herself at the window, looking out at the snow-covered town and wondering if Jed was having as much trouble sleeping as she was. The thought of him alone in his mountain cabin, staring into the fire with the same mixture of longing and regret that consumed her, was almost unbearable. Christmas morning dawned clear and bright, with fresh snow sparkling like diamonds in the early light. Clara helped Margaret prepare breakfast for the family gathering that would fill their home with children's laughter and the warm chaos of the holiday. She smiled at the right moments, admired the gifts, and participated in all the traditions that made Christmas special. But part of her remained detached, as if she were watching the celebration through glass. Thomas noticed her distraction and pulled her aside during a quiet moment. "Clara, if you need to go see him, if you need to talk to Jed, Margaret and I would understand." The kindness in his voice nearly brought her to tears. "I don't know what I need, Thomas. I don't know anything anymore. Sometimes that's the best place to start," he said gently. "When we think we know everything, we stop listening to our hearts." Up in the mountains, Jed was spending Christmas much as he had for the past 4 years. Quietly, with only Bear for company. But this year felt different. The solitude that had once been a comfort now felt oppressive. Filled with the echo of Clara's voice and the memory of her tears, he found himself thinking about the life they might have built together if things had gone differently. Children around a Christmas tree, Clara's laughter filling their home. The simple contentment of growing old with someone who knew all your faults and loved you anyway. But dwelling on what might have been was a luxury he couldn't afford. The question now was whether there was any path forward. Any way to bridge the chasm that 5 years of hurt and pride had carved between them. As he sat by his fire that Christmas evening, Jed made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, he would ride back to town, not for supplies but for answers. He owed Clara that much, and perhaps he owed himself the chance to find out if love really could conquer all, or if some wounds were simply too deep to heal. Jed's resolve wavered 3 times during the ride back to Elk Hollow the next morning. Each time, he would rein in his horse and sit for long minutes in the saddle, staring down at the town spread out below him like a child's toy village. Each time, Bear would look up at him with those knowing brown eyes, and Jed would urge the horse forward again. The town was quieter the day after Christmas, most folks sleeping late or visiting family. The general store was closed, a hand-lettered sign on the door announcing it would reopen the following Monday. Jed sat his horse in front of the building, uncertainty gnawing at him like hunger. He'd ridden all this way without a clear plan, driven by nothing more than the desperate need to see Clara again and try to make sense of what had passed between them. A curtain twitched in the window of the living quarters above the store, and Jed's heart jumped. But it was Margaret Miller who appeared, not Clara. She studied him for a moment through the glass, then disappeared. A few minutes later, the front door of the store opened, and she stepped out onto the covered porch. "Mr. Boone," she said formally, though not unkindly. "You're out early this morning, Mrs. Miller." Jed touched the brim of his hat. "I was hoping to speak with Clara if she's available." Margaret crossed her arms, and Jed could see the protective sister in her stance. "She's been upset since your encounter yesterday. I'm not sure another meeting is wise. I understand your concern, ma'am, but there are things that need saying between us, and what if she doesn't want to hear them?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Jed had no good answer, because he wasn't certain himself what Clara wanted. All he had were those moments of raw honesty beside the birch tree and the tears in her eyes when he'd walked away. "Then I'll respect her wishes," he said finally. "But I need to ask her myself." Margaret studied him with the shrewd eyes of a woman who'd raised 3 children and helped run a successful business. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her because her expression softened slightly. "She's at the church," Margaret said. "Went early to pray and think. Whether she'll want to see you is another matter entirely." The little white church sat at the end of Main Street, its simple spire reaching toward the grey winter sky. Jed had been married there in front of half the town, and with more hope in his heart than he'd known what to do with. He'd also attended his parents' funeral there, and a handful of Sunday services before he'd retreated to his mountain hermitage. The building held too many memories, both sweet and bitter. He tied his horse to the fence and approached the church quietly, Bear padding beside him through the snow. The heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, and warm lamplight spilled out into the morning gloom. Jed paused at the threshold, suddenly uncertain of his welcome in this sacred space. Clara knelt in the front pew, her head bowed in prayer, still wearing the same sapphire dress from yesterday. The sight of her there, so still and contemplative, made Jed's chest tight with emotion. She looked fragile in the soft light, but he knew better. Clara had always possessed a core of steel. Beneath her gentle exterior, it was what had given her the strength to leave him when staying would have destroyed them both. Bear had no such hesitations about entering God's house. The old dog trotted down the aisle, his nails clicking on the wooden floor, and settled himself beside Clara's pew with a contented sigh. Clara looked up at the sound, and her eyes went wide when she saw Jed standing in the doorway. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I didn't mean to disturb your prayers. I can wait outside." "No." Clara's voice was soft but clear. "Come in. Close the door. You're letting in the cold." Jed did as she asked, then walked slowly down the aisle toward her. The church felt different in the morning light, more intimate somehow. Dust motes danced in the colored light from the stained glass windows, and the silence was so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. "Margaret said you might be here," he said, stopping a respectful distance from her pew. "I needed somewhere quiet to think." Clara straightened but didn't stand. "And you? What brings you back to town so soon?" "Who?" The word came out more bluntly than he'd intended. Yesterday, what happened between us? I can't stop thinking about it. Clara's hands tightened in her lap. Jed, I told you, I know what you told me. But we never finished talking. We never said the things that needed saying. Some things are better left unsaid, are they? Jed moved closer, though he was careful not to crowd her. We spent the last 2 years of our marriage not saying things. Not talking about what was wrong, not fighting about what mattered, not being honest about what we needed from each other. Maybe if we'd been braver about speaking the truth, things might have ended differently. Clara looked up at him then, and he could see the internal struggle playing out across her features. And what truth would you speak now, Jedediah Boone? What words do you think could possibly make any difference after all this time? The challenge in her voice sparked something in him. Not anger, but a desperate honesty that cut straight to the bone. That I loved you more than my own life, and I was too proud and stupid to show it properly. That I let my fear of being vulnerable drive you away instead of fighting for what we had. That not a day has passed in 5 years when I haven't regretted the man I was and wished I could be the man you deserved. The words hung between them, like smoke from an altar fire. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. And what good does that do us now? She whispered. We can't go back, Jed. We can't undo the hurt we caused each other. No, he agreed, kneeling down so they were at eye level. We can't go back, but maybe we could go forward. Maybe we could try to build something new on the ashes of what we had before. I'm scared. The admission came out so quietly he almost didn't hear it. I'm scared that we just hurt each other all over again. I don't think I could survive losing you twice. Jed reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hands in his. They were cold, as they'd always been in winter, and the familiar sensation nearly broke his heart. I'm scared too, he said. Terrified, if I'm being honest. But I'd rather fail trying to love you properly than succeed at living without you. Clara's hands trembled in his, and for a moment Jed thought she might pull away entirely. Instead, she tightened her grip, as if anchoring herself to something solid in a world that had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. What are you asking of me, Jed? She said, her voice barely above a whisper. What do you want? A chance, he said simply. A chance to prove that I've learned something in 5 years of missing you. A chance to show you that I can be the partner you needed me to be the first time, and if we try and fail again, if we discover that some things are too broken to mend, then at least we'll know we tried. At least we'll have honest answers, instead of a lifetime of wondering what might have been. Clara closed her eyes, and Jed could see the war being fought behind her eyelids. When she opened them again, there was something different in her expression. Not hope exactly, but a cautious willingness to consider possibilities. I would need time, she said carefully. Time to think, to pray, to decide if I have the courage for this. And if we were to try again, it couldn't be the way it was before. We'd need to talk about everything that went wrong, really talk about it, not just pretend the past didn't happen. I understand, and it would have to be slow. I won't be rushed into anything. No matter how I might feel about you, I wouldn't ask you to be. She studied his face, as if searching for signs of the impetuous young man who had swept her off her feet and then broken her heart. What she found there seemed to reassure her, because some of the tension left her shoulders. There's something else, she said hesitantly. Something I need you to understand about the woman I am now. Not the girl you married. Tell me. I won't live in isolation again. Jed, I won't spend months at a time with no one but my husband for company. I need people, community, a life that extends beyond just the two of us. If we were to try again, that life would have to include the town, the church, the people who've become my family here. The words hit him like cold water. His mountain cabin, his solitary traplines, the life he'd built in the wilderness, all of it was exactly what Clara was saying she couldn't accept. For a moment, panic rose in his throat. She was asking him to give up everything that had defined him for the past 5 years. But then he looked at her face, saw the quiet strength there, and realized something important. The woman sitting before him wasn't the young bride who had tried to adapt herself to his vision of their life together. This Clara knew who she was and what she needed. She wasn't asking him to change. She was telling him what a life with her would require and leaving the choice up to him. "I hear you," he said slowly, "and I won't pretend that doesn't scare me. The town, all those people, I've gotten used to the quiet. I know. But Jed, we failed before partly because we tried to build a life that only worked for one of us. If we're going to try again, it has to work for both of us, or it won't work at all." The wisdom in her words humbled him. She was right, of course. Their first marriage had foundered on his stubborn insistence that love should be enough, that Clara should be happy with whatever life he chose to provide. He'd never really asked what she wanted or needed. He'd simply assumed she would adapt to his choices. "You're right," he said finally. "You're absolutely right. I was selfish before, Clara. I thought providing for you meant making all the decisions about how we'd live. I never really asked what would make you happy, and I was too young to insist on being heard," she replied. "I thought love meant sacrificing everything for the other person, even when that sacrifice was destroying us both." They sat in silence for a while, hands still clasped, both lost in memories of their younger selves and the painful lessons that had brought them to this moment. Bear had curled up in the aisle between their pew and the altar, as if standing guard over this fragile conversation. "So what happens now?" Clara asked eventually. "Now we take it slow, like you said. We get to know each other again, not the people we were, but the people we've become. We figure out if there's a way to build something together that honors both our needs." "And your traplines? Your cabin in the mountains?" Jed was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with possibilities he'd never allowed himself to consider. "Maybe trapping doesn't have to be my whole life. Maybe there are other ways to make a living, ways that would let me spend winters in town instead of alone on the mountain." "You'd do that?" "Give up the life you've built." "Clara, that life was never really living. It was just surviving. Hiding from the world because I was too proud to admit I'd made mistakes and too scared to try to fix them." He squeezed her hands gently. "I'd rather take the risk of building something real with you than spend another day in that kind of safety." Tears were sliding down Clara's cheeks now, but they seemed different from the tears of yesterday. Not bitter, but cleansing somehow. "I've missed you so much," she whispered. "Even when I was angry with you, even when I told myself I was better off without you, I missed you every single day." "I know," Jed said softly. "I missed you too. Missed your laugh, missed the way you hummed while you cooked, missed having someone to share the sunset with." Bear was good company, but he's a terrible conversationalist. That drew a small laugh from Clara, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since their reunion. The sound of it warmed him more than any fire ever could. "So we're really going to try this?"
she asked.
Two broken people trying to put the pieces back together. "We're not broken," Jed said firmly. "We're just people who learned hard lessons about love and are brave enough to use that knowledge to try again." Clara nodded slowly, as if testing the weight of that possibility. "Then we'd better pray about it," she said, glancing toward the altar, "because we're going to need all the help we can get." Jed had never been much for formal prayer, but kneeling there beside Clara in the quiet church, he found himself offering up the most heartfelt plea of his life, not for success or happiness, but for the wisdom to love well this time, and the courage to keep trying even when it got difficult. The next 3 weeks passed in a careful dance of rediscovery. Jed made the journey to Elk Hollow twice a week, sometimes to help Thomas Miller with heavy lifting at the store, sometimes simply to sit with Clara in Margaret's parlor while she mended or did needlework. They talked about everything and nothing, books they'd read, changes in the town, memories that didn't hurt too much to share. It was like learning to walk again after a long illness, tentative but growing stronger with each step. Clara found herself looking forward to his visits with an anticipation that both thrilled and terrified her. The man who sat across from her in Margaret's parlor was recognizably Jed, but tempered by experience and humility. He listened now when she spoke, really listened, instead of simply waiting for his turn to talk. When she mentioned feeling lonely during the long winter evenings, He didn't immediately offer solutions. He just acknowledged her feelings and asked thoughtful questions about what might help. For his part, Jed was discovering that courting his ex-wife was both easier and harder than courting her the first time. Easier because they already knew each other's fundamental nature. Harder because they both carried the scars of their first failure. Every conversation felt weighted with significance. Every gesture examined for signs of repeating old patterns. It was during his fourth visit that everything changed. Jed had arrived in town earlier than usual, hoping to surprise Clara with lunch from the hotel restaurant. But when he entered Miller's general store, he found Thomas behind the counter looking troubled, and Clara nowhere to be seen. "She's upstairs," Thomas said before Jed could ask. "Dr. Henderson just left. She's been feeling poorly for the past few days. Dizzy spells, nausea, fatigue. Margaret's been worried sick." A cold fist of fear clenched around Jed's heart. "What did the doctor say?" Thomas glanced around the empty store, then leaned closer. "He asked to speak with Margaret privately. They've been up there for near an hour now, and I haven't heard a peep." Jed set down the basket of food he'd brought and moved toward the stairs that led to the family's living quarters. "May I?" "Of course." "She'll want to see you." The stairs creaked under Jed's weight as he climbed toward the voices he could hear through the floorboards. He paused at the top, not wanting to intrude on a private medical consultation, but needing to know that Clara was all right. "Quite sure about this, doctor?" Margaret's voice, tight with concern. "As sure as I can be without sending her to Denver for more advanced testing," came Dr. Henderson's gravelly reply. "But given her symptoms and what you've told me about her situation, I'd say we're looking at about 6 months, possibly 7 if she's careful." Jed's blood turned to ice water. 6 months. The implication hit him like a physical blow. Clara was dying, and they'd wasted 5 years being apart. All their careful conversations about second chances and building something new. None of it mattered if she was going to be taken from him just when they'd found their way back to each other. He must have made some sound, because the conversation in the next room stopped abruptly. A moment later, Margaret appeared in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "Jed," she said softly, "how much did you hear?" "Enough." His voice came out rough as sandpaper. Can I see her?" Margaret's expression was unreadable as she stepped aside to let him pass. Clara sat on the edge of her bed, still wearing her work dress, but looking smaller somehow, more fragile than he'd ever seen her. Dr. Henderson was packing his medical bag with the brisk efficiency of a man who delivered too much bad news over the years. "Jed," Clara said, and her voice sounded strange, not weak exactly, but uncertain in a way that was entirely unlike her. "I'll leave you two to talk," Dr. Henderson said, snapping his bag shut. "Margaret, you know where to find me if you need anything. And Clara, remember what we discussed about taking things easy." After the doctor and Margaret left, Jed stood frozen in the doorway, uncertain of his welcome. Clara patted the bed beside her, and he sat down carefully, as if she might break under any sudden movement. "How much did you hear?" she asked, echoing Margaret's question. 6 months, he said simply. Clara was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands folded in her lap. "Actually," she said finally, "it's more like 7 months. Possibly 8. Clara, I'm so sorry. I know we've just started trying to work things out between us. And now, Jed." She turned to face him fully, and there was something in her expression that stopped his words mid-sentence. "The doctor wasn't talking about me dying." "What?" He stared at her, confused. "But he said 6 months, and Margaret looked so worried. He was talking about when the baby will be born." The words hit Jed like a lightning strike. For a moment he couldn't process what she'd said. "Baby? Clara was having a baby? But that would mean—" "You're pregnant," he said stupidly. "Yes, but we haven't. We've barely even—" He stopped, his mind racing back through their recent encounters. The chaste conversations in Margaret's parlor, the careful distance they'd maintained, the slow rebuilding of trust between them. They hadn't been intimate since before their divorce, which meant, "It's not yours," Clara said quietly, saving him from having to ask the question that was burning in his throat. The admission hung between them like a physical presence. Jed felt something crucial shift inside his chest, not quite breaking, but definitely cracking. All their careful plans, their tentative hopes for a future together. How could any of that survive this revelation? Who? The word came out harsher than he'd intended. Clara flinched, but met his eyes steadily. Daniel Morrison. The school teacher who was here last fall. Jed remembered Morrison, a young man from back east who'd come to teach the town's children for a few months before moving on to a permanent position in Colorado. Educated, well-spoken, the kind of man who would have appealed to Clara's love of books and learning. Did you love him? The question tore at his throat, but he had to know. I thought I did, Clara said softly. He was kind to me and lonely, and I was tired of being alone. We became friends, and then more than friends, and I convinced myself it was love. But when he left for Colorado and asked me to come with him, I couldn't do it. I realized what I felt for him was gratitude, not love, comfort, not passion. And he doesn't know about the baby. No, he left 2 weeks before I realized I was carrying his child. I haven't written to tell him, and I don't intend to. He made his choice when he left. Jed stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his mind reeling. Through the glass, he could see Bear waiting patiently by his horse, unaware that the world had just turned upside down. A baby. Clara was carrying another man's child, and here Jed was, with his careful plans for second chances and new beginnings. I understand if this changes things between us, Clara said behind him. I know it's not what you signed up for when we started talking about trying again. He turned back to face her, studying the woman he'd loved for most of his adult life. She sat perfectly straight on the edge of the bed, her chin lifted in the stubborn way he remembered from their first marriage. But underneath the defiance, he could see the fear that he would walk away again, that she would be left to face this alone. A baby, he said wonderingly. Yes. Are you happy about it? I mean, setting aside everything else, how do you feel about becoming a mother? The question seemed to surprise her. She was quiet for a moment, one hand moving unconsciously to rest on her still flat stomach. Terrified, she said honestly. But also, yes, happy. I've always wanted children, and I was beginning to think it would never happen for me. Even under these circumstances, even knowing how complicated everything is, I can't help but feel grateful for this gift. Jed nodded slowly, pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place in his mind. Margaret looked worried when I came up here. Was she afraid I'd be angry? That I'd cause you trouble? She was afraid you'd leave, Clara said simply. That you'd decide a woman carrying another man's child wasn't worth the complications. The raw honesty in her voice decided him. Jed crossed back to the bed and knelt down in front of Clara, taking her hands in his, exactly as he had in the church 3 weeks earlier. Clara McBride, he said solemnly, do you really think I'd walk away from you again? Do you think I'm fool enough to make the same mistake twice? But the baby will be lucky to have you for a mother, he said firmly. And if you'll have me, if you'll trust me to try again, that child will have a father who'll love it as his own. Because it's part of you. Tears were streaming down Clara's face now, but she was smiling through them. Are you sure? Really sure? Because once you commit to this, Jed, there's no going back. We'll be a family, you, me, and a baby that isn't yours by blood. Then we'll be a family, he said simply. The three of us, and Bear, and whatever other children God might bless us with down the road. If you'll have me, Clara, if you'll marry me again and let me spend the rest of my life proving I can be the man you and this baby deserve. The weeks that followed, Clara's revelation were a whirlwind of practical decisions and emotional reckonings. Word of their renewed courtship and Clara's condition spread through Elk Hollow with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. Most of the townspeople were supportive, having watched both Jed and Clara struggle through their years of separation with sympathy and respect. But there were whispers too, judgment from those who felt that Clara had disgraced herself and that Jed was a fool for taking on another man's responsibility. Jed found he cared little for the opinions of others, but Clara was more sensitive to the talk. He discovered her crying in Margaret's garden one afternoon, after overhearing Mrs. Patterson tell Mrs. Cooper that, Some women just can't seem to keep themselves decent, can they? Let them talk, Jed said, settling down beside Clara on the wooden bench among the dormant rose bushes. Their opinions don't change what we know to be true. And what's that? Clara asked, wiping her eyes with her handkerchief. That love comes in all different forms. And family is what we make it, not what others dictate it should be. Clara leaned against his shoulder, and Jed marveled at how natural the gesture felt after so many years of distance. I just don't want people to think less of you because of my mistakes. Your mistakes. Jed turned to face her. Clara, you were alone and lonely, and you found comfort with a good man who cared about you. There's no shame in that. The only mistake would be letting other people's narrow thinking rob us of the happiness we've found. She was quiet for a moment, then said, Sometimes I wonder if Daniel would have stayed if he'd known about the baby. If I should have told him. The admission stirred something uncomfortable in Jed's chest, not jealousy exactly, but a complex mixture of protectiveness and insecurity. Do you want him to know? No, Clara said without hesitation. What we had was brief and based more on loneliness than love. He has his new life in Colorado, and I have mine here. With you, if you'll still have me. Always, Jed said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. But as February melted into March, and Clara's pregnancy began to show, Jed found himself grappling with doubts he hadn't anticipated. Not about his love for Clara or his commitment to their future. Those remained rock solid. But questions about his ability to be a good father to a child who wasn't his by blood. About whether he could provide the kind of stable, respectable life that Clara and the baby would need. His mountain cabin, which had served him well as a bachelor, was clearly unsuitable for a family. Too small, too isolated, too far from medical help when the baby came. He'd need to find work in town, establish himself as more than just the hermit trapper who came down from the hills for supplies. The prospect was both exciting and terrifying. Thomas Miller, bless him, offered Jed a position helping to expand the general store into a proper trading post. Business has been growing, Thomas explained, as they sat in his office above the store. What with the railroad talk and more settlers coming through, we could use someone who knows the mountain country and can deal with the trappers and hunters. Someone they trust. It was honest work, and it would keep him in town year-round, but it represented a fundamental change in everything Jed had built his adult life around. No more solitary months in the wilderness, no more living entirely by his own schedule and whims. It meant becoming part of a community again, with all the responsibilities and complications that entailed. It's a generous offer, Jed said carefully. But I need to ask, how do you and Margaret really feel about me marrying Clara? About taking on another man's child? I know you care about her like a daughter, and if you have concerns... Jed, Thomas interrupted gently, Margaret and I have watched Clara try to rebuild her life for 5 years now. We've seen her put on a brave face while her heart was breaking, seen her throw herself into church work and community service, trying to fill the hole you left behind. When you came back into her life, we saw something we hadn't seen since she was a young bride. Hope. Real, genuine hope for happiness. The older man leaned forward, his expression earnest. As for the baby, every child deserves to be wanted and loved. Clara wants this child, and you've made it clear you'll love it as your own. That's more than many children born in wedlock can claim. We'd be honored to have you as family, Jed. Honored and grateful. The conversation left Jed feeling both humbled and more determined than ever to prove worthy of the trust being placed in him. He threw himself into learning the business side of Thomas's operation, studying ledgers and suppliers with the same intensity he'd once applied to reading animal tracks. He also began the process of selling his mountain cabin and trap lines to Jake Stevens, a younger man who'd been working a smaller territory and was eager to expand. Clara, meanwhile, was wrestling with her own preparations and anxieties. As her pregnancy progressed, she found herself exhausted more often than not, forcing her to step back from some of her duties at the store and church. The enforced rest gave her too much time to think, to worry about all the ways their carefully laid plans might go wrong. The physical Changes in her body were constant reminders of the life growing within her and of the complicated circumstances that had brought them to this point. She found herself alternately grateful for the child and worried about the challenges they would face as an unconventional family in a conventional town. One evening in late March, as she and Jed sat in Margaret's parlor planning their wedding, Clara voiced the fear that had been growing in her heart. "What if I'm not a good mother?" she asked suddenly, setting down the list of wedding guests she'd been reviewing. "What if I don't know how to love this baby properly?" Jed looked up from the farming journal he'd been reading, another sign of how much his life was changing. "What makes you think you wouldn't be?" "I don't know anything about babies, Jed. I've never even held one for more than a few minutes. What if I make mistakes? What if I'm too selfish or impatient or—" "Clara," Jed set aside his journal and moved to sit beside her on the sofa. "Do you remember Mrs. Henderson's cat, the one that had kittens in your barn during our first winter together?" Clara looked puzzled by the apparent change of subject. "Yes, Duchess, what does that have to do with anything? You'd never cared for baby animals before, but you spent hours with those kittens. Made sure they stayed warm, helped the mother cat when she was struggling to feed them all, found homes for each one when they were old enough to leave their mother. You had an instinct for caring even then. That was different. They were just animals." "No," Jed said firmly. "It was exactly the same. You saw creatures that needed care, and you gave it without thinking, without hesitation. You'll do the same with our baby because that's who you are, someone who loves fiercely and protects what matters to her." "Our baby," Clara repeated softly, testing the words. "You really think of it that way?" "I think of it as ours, because it's part of you, and you're going to be my wife. Blood doesn't make a family, Clara. Love does. Choice does. Showing up every day and doing the work does." As they sat there in the lamplight, Clara's hand resting on her growing belly and Jed's arm around her shoulders, they both felt the weight of the future settling around them like a warm blanket. There would be challenges ahead. Clara's delivery, raising a child, building a marriage on the foundation of their shared scars and hard-won wisdom. But for the first time in either of their lives, those challenges felt manageable because they wouldn't be facing them alone. The wedding was set for the first Sunday in April, just 2 weeks away. Pastor Williams had agreed to perform the ceremony, despite some grumbling from the more conservative members of his congregation. Margaret had taken charge of the preparations with the efficiency of a military commander, declaring that Clara deserved a beautiful wedding, regardless of the circumstances. Besides, she'd told her husband when he'd worried about the expense, these two have been through enough heartache. If we can give them one perfect day to start their new life together, it's the least we can do. As Jed made his final trip up to the mountain cabin to collect his remaining belongings, he found himself thinking about the man he'd been when he'd first built this place. Angry, hurt, determined to prove he didn't need anyone. The cabin had been both sanctuary and prison, protecting him from further heartbreak, but also preventing him from growing into the person Clara needed him to be. Now, as he packed the last of his possessions into wooden crates, he felt no sadness about leaving this solitary life behind. The cabin had served its purpose, giving him the space and time he'd needed to heal from their first failed marriage. But healing was only the beginning. The real work, learning to love well, to be a true partner, to build something lasting, that work was just beginning. Bear seemed to understand that this was a momentous occasion. The old dog followed Jed from room to room, supervising the packing process with the gravity of a general reviewing troops. When everything was loaded onto the wagon, Bear jumped up onto the seat beside Jed and looked back at the cabin one last time, his tail wagging. "Ready to go home, old boy?" Jed asked, and Bear's enthusiastic bark left no doubt about his answer. As they descended the mountain path for the final time, Jed allowed himself one look back at the life he was leaving behind. Then he turned his face toward Elk Hollow, toward Clara, toward the future they would build together. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them as a family. And that, he realized, made all the difference in the world. The morning of April 6, 1888, dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of crystalline air that made every sound carry farther than it should. Clara woke before sunrise in Margaret's spare room, her hand instinctively moving to the curve of her belly where the baby had been restless all night. As if sensing the importance of the day ahead, today she would marry Jedediah Boone for the second time. The thought filled her with a mixture of joy and terror that made her stomach flutter, though whether from nerves or the baby's movements, she couldn't say. Margaret appeared in the doorway with a tray of tea and toast, her sister's face glowing with the satisfaction of a woman who had successfully orchestrated what promised to be the social event of Elk Hollow's spring season. "How are you feeling?" Margaret asked, setting the tray on the bedside table and studying Clara's face with concern. "Like I might be sick," Clara admitted. "But I think it's nerves more than the baby." Second thoughts. Clara considered the question seriously, as she had every morning for the past 2 weeks. The easy answer would have been no. She loved Jed with a depth that sometimes frightened her, and she believed in their ability to build something lasting this time. But the deeper truth was more complicated. "Not about Jed," she said finally. "Never about Jed, but about everything else, about whether I'm brave enough to trust this happiness, whether I deserve another chance at love after the choices I've made." Margaret sat down on the edge of the bed, her expression gentle but firm. "Clara McBride, you listen to me. Every person in this town has made choices they regret. The measure of a person isn't in their mistakes, it's in how they choose to move forward from them. You and Jed have both learned hard lessons about love and forgiveness. That makes you wiser, not less worthy." Before Clara could respond, they heard the sound of wagon wheels in the street below, followed by familiar voices. Margaret moved to the window and smiled. "Your groom has arrived," she announced. "And he's brought quite the entourage." Clara joined her sister at the window and felt her heart skip at the sight below. Jed stood in the street beside a wagon, decorated with white ribbons and spring flowers, looking handsome and nervous in his best suit. But it wasn't just Jed who had come. Thomas was there, along with Jake Stevens and 3 other men from town, all dressed in their Sunday finest and grinning like schoolboys. As they watched, Jed looked up at the window where Clara stood, and their eyes met across the distance. Even from 2 stories up, she could see the love and determination in his expression, the quiet promise that they would get it right this time. The knot of anxiety in her chest began to loosen. "He's really here," she whispered. "Did you think he wouldn't be?" I was afraid he might wake up this morning and realize what he was taking on. A pregnant ex-wife, a ready-made family, all the complications that come with that." Margaret's laugh was warm and knowing. "Honey, that man has been sleeping outside your door every night for the past week, like a guard dog protecting something precious." "He's not going anywhere." Clara turned from the window, surprised. "He's been doing what?" "Didn't you know? He's been bedding down in the store's back room. Said he wanted to be close, in case you needed anything. Thomas has been bringing him coffee and breakfast every morning." The revelation filled Clara with a warmth that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine streaming through the window. Here was proof, if she'd needed it, that Jed had truly changed. The young man she'd first married would never have thought to provide such quiet, undemanding comfort. This Jed understood that love was often found in the small gestures, the daily choice to be present and protective without being possessive. "Now," Margaret said briskly, "we'd better get you ready. Your wedding dress isn't going to put itself on, and Pastor Williams gets cranky when ceremonies start." Late, the dress was a compromise between Clara's condition and the formality of the occasion, a beautiful blue silk that Margaret had altered to accommodate Clara's changing figure, with ivory lace at the collar and cuffs that had belonged to their mother. It wasn't the white gown of a first-time bride, but it was perfect for a woman beginning a new chapter with hard-won wisdom and realistic hope. As Margaret helped her with the buttons and pins, Clara caught sight of herself in the mirror and paused. The woman looking back at her was undeniably older than the girl who had first married Jed nearly 8 years ago. But there was something in her eyes that had been missing for a long time, a quiet confidence, a sense of her own worth that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it in every possible way. Margaret smiled and handed her the simple bouquet of wildflowers that Jed had picked himself that morning, daffodils and crocuses and early violets that spoke of new beginnings, and the promise of spring after a long, hard winter. "Then let's go get you married," Margaret said. And Clara's heart soared with the absolute certainty that this time they would get it right. The little white church had been transformed for the occasion. Margaret and the church ladies had outdone themselves with arrangements of spring flowers and white ribbons, turning the simple sanctuary into something that would have made any bride proud. But as Clara walked down the aisle on Thomas's arm, she barely noticed the decorations. Her entire world had narrowed to the man waiting for her at the altar. Jed stood perfectly still as she approached, but she could see the emotion working in his face. When their eyes met, his careful composure cracked slightly, and she saw wonder there, as if he couldn't quite believe this moment was real. Bear sat beside him, wearing a white ribbon around his neck and looking as dignified as any best man ever had. Pastor Williams opened his worn Bible and began the familiar words of the marriage ceremony. But these vows felt different from their first wedding. Then they had been young and confident, certain that love would conquer any obstacle. Now they spoke their promises with the weight of experience behind them, understanding the true cost of the commitment they were making. "Jedediah," Pastor Williams said, "do you take Clara to be your wife, to love and honor her in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Jed said, his voice strong and clear. "I take her as she is, and I promise to love not just her, but the child she carries as my own family. I promise to be the man she deserves and to choose love even when it's difficult." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the addition to the traditional vows. Even here, in front of the entire town, Jed was making it clear that he accepted all of her, her past, her present and their uncertain future, when it was her turn. Clara's voice was steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I do take you, Jedediah, as my husband. I promise to trust you with my heart again, to build a life with you based on honesty and partnership. I promise to be brave enough to speak my needs and strong enough to support you in yours." Pastor Williams smiled as he pronounced them husband and wife. "You may kiss your bride," he said, and Jed stepped forward with reverent care. The kiss was gentle, full of promise and hope, rather than passion. When they broke apart, the small congregation erupted in applause and cheers. Clara looked out at the faces of their friends and neighbors, some tearful, all genuinely happy for the couple who had found their way, back to each other against all odds. But it was the reception afterward that would remain in Clara's memory as the true beginning of their new life together. The church ladies had prepared a feast in the social hall, and the entire town seemed to have turned out to celebrate. Children ran between the tables while their parents shared stories and laughter. Musicians had set up in one corner, filling the room with fiddle music and song. Jed never left Clara's side, but not in the possessive way of their youth. Instead, he seemed to understand instinctively when she needed his support, and when she needed space to accept congratulations from old friends. When Mrs. Patterson, the same woman who had gossiped about Clara's condition, approached with genuine good wishes and an offer to help when the baby came, Clara felt Jed's hand tighten briefly on hers in shared surprise and gratitude. "People can change," he murmured in her ear as Mrs. Patterson moved on to compliment Margaret on the food. "Yes," Clara agreed, thinking not just of their neighbor but of themselves. "They can." As the afternoon wore on and the celebration began to wind down, Jed pulled Clara aside to a quiet corner of the hall. "Are you tired?" he asked, studying her face with concern. "We can leave whenever you're ready." "Not tired," Clara said, though in truth the day had been more emotionally draining than physically exhausting. "Just overwhelmed, I think, in the best possible way. Good overwhelmed or bad overwhelmed?" "Good," she said without hesitation. "Very good. I keep expecting something to go wrong, for someone to object or for you to change your mind, but instead, we're married, Jed finished. Again, for keeps this time. For keeps. Clara agreed. They stood together watching their friends and family celebrate around them, and Clara realized that this was what she had been missing during their first marriage, the sense of community, of belonging to something larger than just themselves. They weren't just a couple trying to make it alone against the world. They were part of a web of relationships and support that would help them weather whatever storms might come. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Boone?" Jed asked, and the name sent a thrill through Clara that had nothing to do with convention and everything to do with the man who spoke it. "Ready," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. As they prepared to leave for the small house Thomas had helped them rent on the edge of town, Bear trotted over to join them, his ribbon slightly askew, but his tail wagging with satisfaction. Their family of 3, soon to be 4, was finally complete. 3 months later, on a sweltering July afternoon, Clara's labor pains began just as she was hanging laundry in the backyard of their small house. The timing was typical of the way their new life together had unfolded, never quite according to plan, but somehow always working out for the best. Jed had been at the store, helping Thomas with a shipment of supplies, when young Billy Henderson came running to fetch him. By the time he reached home, Clara was sitting calmly in their bedroom while Dr. Henderson examined her. Margaret bustling about with the efficiency of a woman who had helped deliver half the babies in Elk Hollow. "How are you feeling?" Jed asked, kneeling beside the bed and taking Clara's hand. "Like I'm about to meet our child," Clara said, squeezing his fingers as another contraction built. "Are you ready for this?" Looking into her eyes, those deep blue eyes that had haunted his dreams for 5 years, Jed felt a peace settle over him that he'd never experienced before. "I've been ready since the day you told me about the baby." The labor progressed slowly through the afternoon and into the evening. Jed stayed by Clara's side despite Dr. Henderson's suggestion that he might be more comfortable waiting downstairs. He held her hand through each contraction, wiped her forehead with cool cloths, and whispered words of encouragement when the pain became overwhelming. Bear had stationed himself outside the bedroom door, occasionally whining softly but refusing to be moved, despite Margaret's attempts to shoo him away. "That dog knows something important is happening," she told Thomas when he suggested putting Bear outside. "He's standing guard." As the sun set and the evening grew quiet around them, Clara's contractions intensified. Through it all, Jed marveled at her strength. The woman he'd married the first time had been lovely but fragile, easily overwhelmed by hardship. This Clara faced pain and uncertainty with a grace that took his breath away. At 11:47 that night, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Dr. Henderson placed the baby in Clara's arms, and Jed got his first look at the child he'd promised to love as his own. She was perfect, tiny and red-faced and beautiful, with a shock of dark hair and her mother's delicate features. But it was the moment she opened her eyes and seemed to look directly at him that Jed felt his heart expand beyond anything he'd thought possible. "Hello, little one," he whispered, reaching out to touch one impossibly small fist. "I'm your papa." Clara was crying and laughing at the same time, exhausted but radiant with joy. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" "Just like her mother," Jed said, leaning down to kiss Clara's forehead. "What should we call her?" They had discussed names for weeks, but never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their daughter in the lamplight, Clara said, "Hope. I want to call her Hope." "Hope Boone," Jed said, testing the sound of it. "I like it. Hope for new beginnings." Dr. Henderson finished his ministrations and pronounced both mother and baby healthy. Margaret bustled about, cleaning up and preparing a tray of food for Clara. Through it all, Jed sat beside the bed, one arm around his wife and one finger gently stroking Hope's cheek, marveling at the way such a tiny person could so completely transform his understanding of love. When Bear was finally allowed into the room, he approached the bed with unusual caution, as if sensing the significance of the moment. He sniffed delicately at the baby, then settled down beside the bed with a contented sigh, clearly accepting his role as the family's protector. "Look at that," Clara said softly. "He approves." As the weeks that followed turned into months, and the months into seasons, the Boone family settled into a rhythm that felt both new and timeless. Jed thrived in his work at the expanding trading post, discovering that he had a natural talent for business and a gift for dealing with the rough men who came down from the mountains to trade their furs and goods. Clara flourished in her role as wife and mother, but more than that, she found her voice as a partner in their marriage. When disagreements arose, as they inevitably did, she no longer retreated into hurt silence. Instead, she spoke her mind clearly and expected Jed to do the same. They argued sometimes, but they also talked through their problems with the hard-won wisdom of people who had learned the cost of leaving things unsaid. Hope grew into a cheerful, curious baby who seemed to bring joy wherever she went. The people of Elk Hollow, who had initially whispered about the circumstances of her birth, quickly fell under her spell. She became the town's unofficial mascot, passed from arm to arm during church services and social gatherings, loved by everyone who met her. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most to Jed, evenings when he would come home from work to find Clara humming while she cooked dinner, Hope playing on a blanket on the floor, Bear keeping watch over them all. These were the moments he had dreamed of during his lonely years in the mountains, the domestic happiness he had thrown away in his youth and thought lost forever. On Christmas Eve of 1888, exactly 1 year after that fateful encounter in Miller's General Store, Jed and Clara bundled Hope up and walked through the snow to the old birch tree behind the town. The carved letters were still there, weathered but legible, a testament to young love and enduring hope. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked, shifting Hope to her other arm. "Taking on all this complexity when you could have had a simpler life?" Jed considered the question seriously, as he did all of Clara's inquiries these days. "I regret the years we lost," he said finally. "I regret the pain we caused each other. But this, our family, our life together, this is what I was always meant to have. I just had to grow wise enough to recognize it." Clara smiled and leaned against his shoulder, just as she had that first day when Bear had led them to this tree. "I love you, Jedediah Boone, all of you exactly as you are. And I love you, Clara Boone, both of you," he said, tickling Hope under the chin until she giggled. "Forever and always, just like we carved in this tree all those years ago." As they walked back toward town, toward the warm lights of their home and the life they had built together, Jed reflected on the truth that some stories don't end. They just begin again, better and wiser than before. Love, he had learned, wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up day after day and choosing to build something beautiful from whatever materials life provided. Behind them, Bear trotted through the snow, tail wagging, as if he too understood that some promises, once made with true intention, have the power to reshape the world.